I can, I think we're ready. If we can ask the panel members all to come back up. Okay, we've got lots of questions. We'll start with Dr. Coe. Let's see. Do you have any tips for training your staff to help with some of these more useful questions? Do you work with training your staff for what you're working with there?
Yeah, so in terms of training staff, I think it's really about centering on your changing behavior. And so you want to take a sort of staged approach to this. So I would work very much on one thing. So if I were to pick something, I'd probably start with that open-ended question so we can get a bit more of a comprehensive history that then helps support the veterinarian or technician, whoever might be making the recommendation. And so I think largely it comes back to recognizing that we need to change behavior, as do our clients need to change behavior, and so we want to take similar approaches where staff see the value in that. And I think as they start using some of these tools, and so again, start with one, they see it being effective, it's almost like a snowball effect where they're like, okay, give me the next one, because I see the value in that. So that'll be, yeah, where I'll leave it.
Okay, and this is, I think, to me, is kind of a related question. I've lost what the question is. Most veterinary visits are quite short. They said 20 to 30 minutes. I know some first opinion practitioners are doing 15-minute ones as well, and long on items to be covered. So again, asking about encouraging vets to train and leverage their staff to obtain the diet and activity and have some of these conversations, which is sort of what you were just covering there. One for Dr. Winston. If a veterinarian were to discuss dysbiosis with an owner, which I think would be kind of brave, but anyway, with an obese pet, I feel like they would ask if probiotics would help because it's easier than doing a weight loss plan. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I actually get that a lot too. And I think we are still in the early phases of understanding how to manipulate that dysbiosis to confer that benefit. So I think we have to remember that probiotics have a very narrow window potentially. So, you know, thinking about products that we have available on the market, we know for certain diseases that there may be a health benefit, but it doesn't mean that that same probiotic is going to have a benefit across all the diseases. So this is where it gets tricky, and I know people get kind of annoyed when we keep saying it's complicated, but it is complicated, and it's not potentially a one organism fits all approach. And so studies like the SLIM study where we're using multi-omics hopefully will help us to get to that. So we can, instead of having to give an FMT where we're giving all those microbial products, we could really laser focus in and say, well, maybe we just need to give this, you know, collection of organisms, or even maybe it's not the organisms and their metabolites are what's really important, and part of that is the signaling that's happening to the host, but also to the other organisms there.
Okay, I've got another question for you, which I think is also a really interesting one. Does calorie restriction or intermittent calorie restriction affect the composition of the microbiome? And if so, do they affect the microbiome differently?
Yeah, that's a great question. So definitely, as you change nutrients that are available to this ecosystem, it is going to change. And we also have to think about, too, that this isn't a static situation, right? So it is an ecosystem, it is constantly in flux. So any restriction of calories or change even, for example, I work a lot with mice, and even something as basic as changing a water source can have a large impact on the microbiome as far as who's there. So definitely changes like that could impact what composition is present.
For Dr. Delgado, one type of food puzzle was not shown to increase quality of life during a weight loss study. Do you have any tips for specific enrichment toys that improve quality of life, like one toy over the other, or is it just trial and error for the individual pet?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And I think we don't really have great standardized tools for measuring quality of life that like an owner can easily assess. So I always go back to the idea of choices, and I think people sometimes buy one thing and expect their cat to love it, and we all know how that goes. So I always recommend, trying a few different things and seeing, because I do think that we have to typically tailorize any type of enrichment or mental stimulation for our pets to suit their needs, their age, their life stage, their activity level, their food motivation if it's a food puzzle. So yeah, I don't have a particular like one size fits all. And I think that we still need a lot of research on what actually affects cats' quality of life as far as enrichment is concerned.
I actually have my own question sort of related to that too. Is, do you get concerned, or is the point when you get concerned about some of the food puzzles with cats with arthritis?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are types of food puzzles that can be used with, I mean, I've had three-legged cats use them, my cat was using food puzzles until about 2 weeks before she passed away. So, you know, I don't think there's necessarily any problems, but you do have to consider their physical abilities and also their motivation to eat. So I'm much more careful with older cats.
And one for Dr. Webb. Practicing veterinary medicine and especially veterinary nutrition involves more and more owner psychology. Do you have any resources for veterinarians to learn more about counseling owners to care for their pets?
Yes, the behavior change wheel. Like, I wish, it's the book I wish I'd written. It's a brilliant book, and it's not, I don't know, people still read books. I don't read enough books, and I'm daunted by the prospect of having to read a book, but actually it's got big letters, and it doesn't take very long to read. I really, really recommend that you read the behavior change wheel. It's got some basic psychological principles in it, and it takes you through step by step how to actually use behavioral science to do practical things and to support people to change their behavior.
Thank you. For Dr. Winston, are there changes in the gut microbiota in obese dogs cause or consequence? What are the most important factors that contribute to this dysbiosis? High-fat diet or low-fiber diet, genetics, castration, adipocytokinins, chronic inflammation? You want to give a whole new talk.
Yeah, this is hard, chicken or the egg, right? And this is coming up in the human world as well. So I think that this is where having organized groups that are doing multi-center trials in the veterinary space are really important, because we need to get more information about the microbiome in a very mechanistic way. So right now, kind of this state that we're in veterinary medicine is a lot of description, which is what we need to set the foundation so we can start to formulate specific hypotheses to figure out mechanistically what we think is happening in that microbial community. And once we start then to design studies around modulating the microbiome with those hypotheses, we're going to be able to start to look at that further. But until we, have a description for a disease, we aren't able to form those hypotheses. And so I think that, we're getting there. And this is the Achilles heel of microbiome science in general, not just plaguing veterinary medicine. This is happening in the human side too. It's a complex ecosystem. It requires a high level of bioinformatics. It requires integration of people that have computer science bioinformatic background and people that have the physiology and knowledge and medical expertise to put it together. So I think that, I'm hopeful over my career that we'll start to be able to do that, but it is really, this is a field that's at its infancy in veterinary medicine and also in human.
For Dr. Coe, I found that presenting too many options to a client can overwhelm them. How can we allow them to be involved in decisions without giving them too many options? And I'm worried that presenting options may encourage them to make a decision that isn't the best for their pet.
Yeah, so that's a great question, and I think it is coming to a balance in that. So in general, 2 to 3 pieces of information is kind of a processing point. And then you would definitely want to check in with the client and see where they are in terms of understanding the information you've presented to them. I think the piece is making sure clients are aware that they have options. I also think we need to be careful that we're not making decisions for our clients, because that's when it starts to go the other way on us. When we don't present options, we make decisions because we're making assumptions about what we think our client wants. And so it's finding the right balance. And it's not easy. I think I said that in my presentation, presenting options and presenting them in a way where a client truly understands the value, which is why I start using, particularly in more complicated decision-making processes, something like the what I call a value matrix was in my presentation to help clients truly follow and share the information. So manage the amount of information, check in to see where clients are, avoid making decisions for your clients. And I mean, largely it comes back to a tool we call chunking and checking, where you give some information and you make sure by checking in frequently with the client that they're on the way with you. And in the end, I think you'll see that coming together, you will come to a place where hopefully, more times than not, both parties are invested and committed on the path forward.
And this one's sort of directed for the whole panel, so I'll let sort of anyone who wants to jump in on this first, go ahead. How do you consider the quality of life of the dog and the owners or caretakers during the weight loss period? And how do you address concerns about this by the client? For example, a cat gets aggressive or an attacks hangry, she added, he or she, the owner every time the owner goes into the kitchen. Who wants to start?
I can start.
Okay.
I mean, it is a good question about quality of life, and I think a lot of it is the owner's anthropomorphization, I guess, if that's a word, of what their pet is experiencing based on the behaviors they see. So we do know that when you put cats on a diet, they will actually become more affectionate, generally. So those are food soliciting behaviors that we interpret as affectionate, right? The rubbing, the purring, the meowing, getting in the lap. These are all attempts to probably get someone to go to the kitchen and feed them. So I think part of it is trying to educate the owner on what that means and why is that the only thing the pet has to do is obsess on food, right? So it gets back to that need for stimulation in the environment. I really try to avoid, I mean, I know I use the term enrichment a lot, but I think when we use that word and rely on that to describe environmental needs of our companion animals, that the enrichment becomes something extra. So we understand that the pet needs food and water and that they need a yearly vet exam, but providing them with play or exercise is enrichment somehow that's separated from those essential needs. And in my opinion, those environmental needs are as essential as food and water, and so we really need to change people's thinking about that. So that would be my first, framing is like, are you really assessing this correctly, or are you you're feeling bad because you're changing something that to you symbolizes love?
Any comments?
I can build on that a little
Okay,
bit.
yeah,
I think
go for
it
it.
does come back to the communication as well and making sure that we are supporting those clients who are in those action or maintenance phase. And I think Michael's pieces are finding out which tool is the tool that client needs. And so I think developing a program and utilizing your team to have the follow-up to be able to detect that, because when programs or plans go awry, they tend to go awry quickly and you lose them. And so I think checking in early and then having the support and then having the knowledge to support the support, once you figure out what that individual client and animal needs, I think goes a long way.
I guess I can add to that. When we started on this adventure, the Canine Slim Project, I was very focused on the science and the veterinary care and the nutrition plans and all that piece. And I knew that the owner component was going to be important. We fitted all the dogs with FitBarks and helped owners to be able to track their activity and also give them something at home that they could look at and visually see about how their pet was doing and improving. And that was a huge benefit. We had so many owners at the end that were like, we don't want to give the FitBark backs. So that was one really surprising thing. But the other part that I wish I had gotten to talk to all of you, in more detail before we went on this adventure was the coaching piece. Like having a team that they knew was committed to their pet every week. Like, for example, when Pax had a week that he was off because it was, Thanksgiving and things got a little out of hand, or things like that, we were there to support them and say, it's okay, like this is a blip and it's 1 week and it's not, it's not gonna derail the whole journey for you and Pax. Like, I think that coaching piece, I underestimated the power of what that was gonna mean for these families. And then the other piece that we've gotten really good feedback from our owners about that seems so simple and basic to me is sharing their journey. So actually our social media media team at Ohio State, we would put together these like little stories about how their weight loss journey was going, and the owners took so much pride in that. Like, they were so proud of what their dog had accomplished and what they had accomplished, that even having that, you know, most practices have a Facebook page now. You know, maybe it's that once a month you post a story about how a pet's doing that's on a weight loss plan at your practice. Like, you wouldn't be, you know, you would be surprised about how much of a difference that sort of thing makes, because then they're like, well, when are you going to feature Bailey again, you know? So those little things made a really big difference for our study.
Well, might as well complete the set.
Please do. I know I've heard you speak on this before.
I do think identifying the positive changes, even if they are initially outbalanced by some of the negatives for people, and that might be negatives in terms of effort and time and investment. I mean, one of the things that we noticed in the trial, so the trial that I said wasn't effective, actually, it wasn't effective compared to control. All the dogs lost weight, and that's because they were part of a weight management program in a veterinary practice that was partly effective. And one of the things that owners would say during that weight loss journey was that they noticed that the dog was less breathless on walks, and that was the first thing they noticed. And so I think if there are things that you can ask people to identify before they saw any change in weight or any other changes, the first thing they noticed, dog was less breathless. And actually, a couple of people said that the dog's more lively, and I'd preferred it when he was just laid in front of the fire. But hopefully, he or she was happier.
Okay, Dr. Delgado, what do you recommend for sneaky siblings who steal food? I would say this is also housemates, but who steal food out of the SureFeed during the lag period before it closed, and their point is not a personal question at all.
Well, I don't work for SureFeed, although I love the product, but I do recommend actually contacting them because they do have a bully setting that they have a bully bumper, which you can put around the back. So, you know, I will say from my own experience with my cats, so 2 of them have SureFeed so that Coriander doesn't eat all of their food, but I would say she does occasionally try to break into it, and I am concerned, you know, we try to avoid frustration as much as possible because it's considered an aversive emotional state. At the same time, she does stop. So recognizing that when that happens, like maybe I, you know, need to make some other change in the environment. But I would, as far as the product goes, like with any of the, I mean, there's the Pet Pro RX is another product that does microchip activated feeding on a schedule. So any of those products, talk to the company. I mean, hopefully they have, I mean, these are pretty established companies. They've done a lot of research on them, and so they've heard it. They've heard that these similar problems. So definitely reach out to them because they have a strategy.
Good, because I have to admit I wondered that too when I watched that video. It's like, oh, I can think my cat could get his head in there.
It was worse at first, but then I think they kind of figured out. Yeah.
And Dr. Winston, we know that microbiome is affected by exercise. Do you consider adding a group in your experimental setup to see the impact of exercise and FMT on obesity?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we were worried about that, of how we were going to incorporate that in, which is part of why we were like, well, how can we kind of most efficiently, as far as the budget was concerned, get that information. And so that's where the FitBarks have come into play to kind of get a general idea. We also were worried that we didn't prescribe a certain set of this is what type of exercise we want your pet to do each week. We really were focused on the calorie restriction component. So that will be a Slim 2.0, maybe is adding in exercise, more specific exercise recommendations. But the FitBark data has been really interesting and complicated because as animals start to lose weight, they're more likely that they're going to be active. So as we got out, you know, even 12 weeks in, you can see on the FitBark data that these pets are a lot more active than they were when they started the study, which is the goal, but it makes it really hard to know, you know, what's the factor then that's making the biggest difference.
Right, yeah, to get your answers more simple. Dr. Webb, I was wondering about when you talked about diagnosis, if you can give an example of what you would mean by that.
An example of what it would look like to do a diagnosis?
Yeah, what would that be for someone in practice?
I actually almost feel like Jason's answers. I thought your case study at the end, was it Harry the dog?
Harley.
Harley the dog, yeah, the Burmese mountain dog that you talked through, where you went through that process that don't know if it was you doing it, but you talked through the process of talking to the owner and about what had happened during that 6 months between when Harley was, there and then he started going like that. And you learned that the family, they got 3 young children, but they had 3 young children before, but then the grandmother moved in. And it's that, a behavioural diagnosis is about talking through and understanding which behaviours are going on. So I would start with exactly like Jason described, but then maybe even go a step further and think, well, that grandmother who's formed the bond, she's formed the bond through feeding, then thinking, well, why does she think that feeding is the way to form the bond with the dog? And then what alternative ways could there be to form the bond with the dog if that's what she believes she's feeding, the purpose of the feeding is?
And then that becomes the target behavior to work towards.
Yeah. So it's exactly that. It's a conversation. I mean, the challenge is finding the time to do that consultation.
Any suggestions for how, as practitioners, we fit that into a practice?
Well, one thing that somebody said to me is pre-visit questionnaires. Mm-hmm. So if you know that somebody's coming in with a dog or cat or whatever animal, and you know that it's a consultation about weight, maybe there are a few questions you could ask them to think about beforehand. I don't know how difficult that is from the point of view of the communication process. Maybe they need to be supported through those sort of questions, but pre-work and homework maybe need to be involved.
I also wonder about dedicated time. Like, so you're on a wellness visit, like, the case example that you had, that might not be the time to dive into it fully because you might not have the time. So, you think about human medicine, take my children to the pediatrician, they identify something and they say, you know what, we're gonna have to schedule a follow-up visit to chat about whatever it is. So I wonder, thinking about the idea of saying, hey, we've identified this, we'd like to spend more time talking about it, we need to schedule another visit, to really just focus on that problem, whereas you're not thinking about, okay, what vaccines, what monthly preventatives, you're going through a whole list of other things.
I think that makes a lot of sense in the sense of agenda setting and triaging, and so you need to prioritize where do I spend my time today, and it's not always going to be what you think you can. I think, nutrition, obesity is a team sport, and so thinking about how we can utilize our team in a way that helps manage some of the time demands, I think, is another way. I also think, based on our research, we haven't maximized the efficiencies we can gain through effective communication to this point as a profession, and so again, I think as we fine-tune some of the skills and strengthen some of the bridge that exists, it actually will help with some efficiencies, hopefully reduce some of the time we spend with resistance by managing some of that. So it's not easy, so I'm not trying to simplify it, yet I think there are ways over time through team approaches, through making sure we're agenda setting and triaging priorities, and then continuing to fine-tune and sharpen our communication skills, we can and get more into an appointment than maybe sometimes we're able to currently.
I would also add making sure to just automate things. So can you have templates for follow-up emails and schedule them as soon as that you've seen that client, is just set up those auto follow-ups so that you, I do think that a lot of people with prompts are like, oh, I need to report back my pet's weight, or I need to report back what I did this week, or how he did this week, or am I having any questions or problems? So if you can just set that up, kind of preload it. But I think you need to, I know with my behavior practice, I charge enough to, accommodate those follow-up questions and the time I'm going to spend, or I have to schedule a follow-up with someone. Not everyone is going to be able to afford that, so you have to kind of be able to accommodate your clientele.
Can I also add a slightly left field suggestion, which is one of the things that came out of some of the most recent work we did, where we interviewed stakeholders in vet practices, basically the entire veterinary teams. And we extended the veterinary teams to include the front of house staff and the receptionists. And they got so many insights from the owners that the veterinary professional teams didn't have, because the owners were sat in the waiting room for 15 minutes. And they'd often have a conversation. And I don't know if it's awkward in terms of confidentiality and so on, but you almost want the insights that the receptionist got from the conversation with the client in the waiting room to get through to the vets and the nurses.
Yeah, that kind of comes back to the team approach that someone else had brought up, a couple of people had brought up in their questions. And sort of, this may be unfair, and this I have to admit it's coming from me, sort of between working with the behavior change wheel and the 5 stages, the pre-contemplation, the contemplation, can you two kind of talk about a way to marry these concepts in a practical way in practice?
Very, very easily. In fact, I can be rather evil about the stage to change approach. So one of the strongest critiques of stages to change approach is it's just another measure of motivation.
Okay.
So I think that's too harsh, but it could just be a reflection of how motivated somebody is. They're not motivated, they haven't given it any thought at all. That's pre-contemplation. So do they really want to do it and they're already doing it further down the line?
And so it goes back to sort of the diagnosis to understand whether it's capabilities, opportunities, or motivation. That may be one where we're seeing for a lot of clients, motivation is not there. So it's probably capabilities, which I think is through the conversation again. So back to making the diagnosis. And then that checking in to me is about identifying their capability, where we saw a lot of clients, even those that were motivated, didn't necessarily feel they had all the capability. And so that's an opportunity to kind of weave that together to find out what it is they need support with, which we've talked about already, to achieve greater confidence, which probably is a product of achieving greater capability.
So this is sort of in contemplation and in planning sort of stages.
I think the challenge is the stage of change model. It doesn't describe how you move someone from one stage to the next.
Okay.
And I think what you're saying is actually through capability and opportunity, by providing those things, you can move somebody from a point where they aren't doing it because they don't feel capable of doing it, to starting to do it. So maybe those processes help move people between stages.
And recognizing that it's going to be different depending on where a person might be. Same point you made, it's also going to be different whether it's motivation that's their challenge, capability that's their challenge, or the opportunity. So I think we're saying there's not one size fits all, and we need to take, thoughtful approaches to each individual client, which comes back to my point about the foundation being a history. The only way you know what a client needs is by spending some time to explore it. I use the word time again. Again, there can be ways creatively, team, pre-surveys, other ways to try and get some of that information to address the constant time challenges that we hear about in veterinary practice every day.
Okay, this is back to Dr. Winston. So really, I think this is quite a question. Would it be of any interest to transplant not only thin dog microbiota into an obese dog, but to transplant a sporting dog microbiota to an obese dog?
Yes.
Is that a thing?
This is a wonderful question. Actually, I've gotten it quite a bit, and we were very thoughtful in our lean dogs that we didn't do that to try and not change the outcome, basically, because we don't know. And also, there are some studies on the human side that would suggest that elite human athletes may have some microbes and enzymes similar to the obese microbiome. And so if you actually transplant microbes from elite athletes into someone, or if we did that with dogs, we could actually have the opposite happen, where those microbes are more efficient at getting nutrients available because that individual has essentially trained, evolved, and adapted their microbiome to meet their physiologic state and the requirements that they need. And so we purposely, our lean dogs couldn't be agility dogs. They couldn't, there were a lot of kind of things that when I was setting it up, my postdocs were like, oh my gosh, she's crazy. It's gonna be like no lean dogs out there. But it's like, there are so many different things that could impact the microbiome, and athleticism definitely is one of those that would be of question.
Okay, we've got a couple more for you. We heard in an earlier lectures that bacterial dysbiosis is more a symptom of disease rather than a root cause. For obese patients, do you expect a sustained response from FMT past the period of the weight loss plan, or will owners just revert to past habits, negating your efforts?
Yeah, that's a great question. Part of that kind of center group in the Canine Slim where they are getting FMT for the first 12 weeks and then we switch them over to placebo. This is a blinded study, so the owners and the clinical nutritionists have no idea what treatment groups the dogs are in. And so it is definitely on the microbiome side, we haven't gotten into the weeds on this part of the analysis because the study just finished a couple weeks ago. But that's one of the things that we're going to be looking at is what happens with that engraftment. We also, as part of the study, a human factor that we didn't think about was, or not fully thought about, was at 24 weeks, we did write in that the owners would get 3 additional weight check-ins with our clinical nutrition service with Dr. Parker, because cutting them off from us was actually pretty traumatic for some of these owners, because we've been seeing each other weekly for 24 weeks and we've been helping them with that trajectory. And so our owners have elected to space out those 3 visits and check-ins to make sure that they're still on the right track. So, and we also have some situations where, owners couldn't afford to feed OM after the study. And so we're working with those owners on those check-ins to transition them to a different diet now that they've achieved their weight loss goal. So, we didn't write into the study to sample them past the 24 weeks. I think that, the Companion Animal FMT Consortium has talked about trying to get more of a global registry so that we could put kind of any dog or cat that's received an FMT into a more global resource. So that is happening on the human side. If a human gets an FMT, NIH is tracking them for up to 10 years after that FMT. They're looking at short-term outcomes like, for example, increase in IBD phenotypes, increase in obesity, increased cancer risk, and watching that, but they're looking at them over a period of 10 years. And we've talked about as a group of trying to get a system like that so we could more long-term check what the consequences are of us giving FMT. Because I think, a lot of us, even people here in the room, we use it a lot, but we don't fully understand, even on the human side, what the long-term outcomes are of giving a whole fecal transplant. And so I think that the human data sets are definitely going to help us, but I think veterinary medicine and the consortium are really working to be on kind of the cutting edge of that to try and start looking at some of those questions in veterinary medicine.
I think the second half of that question brings up something I would put to all of the panel then, talking about after weight loss, and this is sort of the maintenance part of the stages as well, that after the weight loss, sort of if anybody can sort of speak to how do we keep owners from reverting back to past habits and the weight regain that is known to be quite a problem in people and for pets.
I liked that when Dr. Winston mentioned people who participated in their study. So we used FitBarks for cats in one of my feeding studies, and I'd say half of the people who participated wanted to buy one after, and we also used webcams, and they wanted to have a camera so they could spy on their cat while they were at work. So I think there's something to be said for getting people to start collecting the data, because once they start, there's something very rewarding about it, especially if things are going well. I talked about my own cat who had a little bump up in her weight after we'd achieved weight loss success. So it is tough. There's kind of this pull to go back to, I think, the pet's preferred weight. So I do think you have to kind of set expectations. Like, this isn't just you fix it and 6 months from now you just forget it. Like, these are habits you have to maintain. But I do think if you can get them, like if you notice they have a Fitbit, they probably will like having a FitBark because they like collecting data. So take advantage of that phenotype of human that really likes getting that information.
Mm-hmm. Any comments from the end of the panel?
I'm tempted to say something, but I feel like it's speculation, so maybe I should say it and couch it in speculation.
Okay.
I feel like the rebound probably isn't as powerful as it is among humans, because I think that what causes the rebound in weight amongst humans is the ongoing temptation, the ongoing battles of self-control, the difficult times that people inevitably go through in life, the ups and downs. Whereas when it's about making a change to the way in which you feed a companion animal, It's about recognizing the problem and going through that process, but then making structural changes to the way in which you feed. So you aren't tempted to go back and feed more. I'm not like, I'll give him an extra bit in this scoop. Maybe you're tempted to go back to the leftovers and you get lazy around the treating and the leftovers, or maybe you're, the behavioral work is very challenging to do that behavioral work without treats, for most of us, sorry. and so I guess there's that temptation, but I don't feel like it's quite as powerful.
I mean, it would be great to do a study to kind of confirm all of this. I'm curious, like the treats, because of the relationship and the bond, I am curious as to what the influence of that could be. I think for me, and I don't have an evidence-based answer to this, it's more of just sort of hypothesis. If we can start using trends, and I really liked Michael's, trending there, it allows us to catch the little blips where we're starting, and it's, even if it's every 6 months they drop in for a weight, we graph it, they can take the graph with them, and we have a copy too, and then we can see when things, because the whole piece around trends is trying to create conversation before it's a problem so that we're taking a more preventive approach. I think the answer I don't have is just like how frequently we need to have them come in so we can do that, and how do we keep people engaged so they are coming in so we can gather that information.
Okay, I've got one more for you, Dr. Winston. So it sounded like you were giving credit to the FMT treatment when all the dogs in your SLIM study lost weight each week, but those dogs were all eating OM, so couldn't we just conclude that OM works really well?
Yeah, well, and there's caveats to that too, right? So the weight loss trajectory for the first 12 weeks, we controlled very, very tightly because we don't want dogs to lose weight too quickly and have it be unhealthy. So, so we purposely would have to change up their caloric requirement in order to make sure that they weren't achieving too much weight loss, or we'd have to restrict more if they didn't meet the goal. And so, I definitely think that we have a lot to look at. This is a huge data set. The study just finished, just 2 weeks ago. Our last dog just finished 2 weeks ago, so we have a lot to look at. But I want to change a perspective a little bit, because the outside goal that we measure, that the owner sees, is the weight, right? But there's a lot of physiologic complications with obesity that the owner can't see, but still are not good. So especially probably the most, one that comes up right away for all of us is thinking about insulin sensitivity and resistance, right? Overall chronic inflammation. So our study is set up to look at that over time. So although right now we haven't run all the stats, it's hard to tell whether there's a true impact of the FMT. All the dogs did achieve their weight loss goals, some faster than others, so that's stuff we're going to start to look back at and use the multi-omics data sets to try to tie in. But more importantly, we're going to be looking at some of those physiologic outcomes that I didn't get to talk about. So now that the cohort's done, we're going to be able to look at some of those things and say, wow, like during the first 12 weeks where we were saying you cannot lose more than 1% to 2%, we saw a huge, increase in insulin sensitivity. That's awesome. Like that makes a really big difference for those pets. So there's a lot of side, outcomes to that study, and there'll be a lot of ways to look at it. So.
Okay, this is, where did it go? I think to Dr. Coe, they didn't direct it to anybody, but anybody can use this because I think it probably fits for all of you. Somebody said, I use active listening with clients. For example, I might say, what I hear you saying is such and such, or you would like to do this, is that right? I think I've heard that called reflective too. Anyway, you didn't mention this type of communication. Is there a reason why we shouldn't do this, or is this something you recommend doing?
So the simple answer is yes, you should do it. And the longer answer, which I won't get into great details, is that communication is a whole toolbox of skills. There was only 50 minutes, so there's only so many I could cover. A talk like mine today, my goal is to get people excited to want to learn more, to go out and do something more comprehensive in terms of sharpening those tools and strengthening the bridge. And so I think because, as I mentioned earlier, it is about behavior change. It is adapting, yet reflective or attentive listening is going to be critical and goes really well hand in hand with open-ended inquiry or questions to kind of reflect back, yes, I've heard what you said, and oftentimes it facilitates more information too without taking more time to ask another question. And so the short answer was yes, continue to use those skills. The longer answer is, yeah, there's a lot more that could be built into the things that we talked about today.
And does anybody have any last minute things they have to say? We're almost to the time. Then it leaves for me to thank all of our panelists for very good presentations, very good talk. So I'd give them a big thank you for that.